So first of all, congratulations. Thank you for being here. So I'd like to start out by asking, how did you all know Yoni in the first place, and what prompted the creation of this film?
So I guess I knew him in the first place. As I mentioned, he was a friend of my father's, and I first met him when I was about 16. Can you hear? Yes? What? Is this actually working? Send some no's. I first met him when I was about 16. I remember I came to New York for a Jewish youth thing, and my father said, get in touch with Yonia Fain. And he took me to the Guggenheim Museum. I'll still remember, and it was very exciting to go to a museum with a real artist. So that was the beginning, and then later when I got married and we lived for a year in Brooklyn, we actually lived in the same neighborhood as Yoni and his wife, Helen. And so we became quite friendly then, and then he asked me to edit his book of poetry, so it goes back a long way.
Maybe I should pass the mic to Shane, because I really knew Yoni very slightly until, I knew of him when he was your predecessor as the head of the Kulturkongress. But I had really no personal connection with him. And the film, I must say, was, for me, a very moving opportunity to get to know him. And as one does in editing a film, living with the interview and trying to piece it together, living with the interview and trying to piece it together and really listening very carefully to what Yoni tells us about his life, that's when I really got to know him. So.
Not sure it's live, is it? No. I worked at I still work at the Congress for Jewish Culture, which published the Zukunft. Yoni mentioned a poem from Shanghai that was published there because your father snuck it out and got it to them. And I started out there as the secretary at the office, and so I'd have various missions to visit Yoni, who was already having trouble with his sight, and it was harder to get around. And one of the amazing things I remember is his ability to dictate poetry that was seemingly fully formed in his head. If it was, on the spot, had to be done right away, you'd call to him and take it down over the phone, or go to him on a trip with some lunch, and he didn't write the poetry down. He had to dictate it to someone who could write in Yiddish, and he would dictate several pages of a poem. There we go. And then have you read it back and say, no, you missed this, or you missed that, or this line was missed. And sometimes he would revise, but he knew exactly what it was that he wanted on the paper. So that was sort of an early memory of meeting him, I guess. Yeah.
So Sheva, what made you want to tell Yoni's story, make this film?
Well, the League for Yiddish has had this project. This is now the completion of it, I guess, unless some new poet arises that we don't know. It was partly I don't want to say pedagogical, but we have this sense that beautiful Yiddish is disappearing. And so where can you best hear it and capture it? And that is in the words of writers. So that's why we began this project. And right away I knew that Yoni would be one of the the writers. We concentrated in North America. Boris Sandler did a number of very good films, mostly with writers living in Israel, and we concentrated here, and so he was just the obvious person. If I can just say something to what Shane said, I don't know that he was completely blind, but he couldn't read his handwriting. He also, at the end, he was, by the way, about 93 in that, what you saw. And he remained sharp as a tack, I think, to the very, very end, in all senses. Anyway, he couldn't read what he wrote, and I mean, I tend to think that I think he was a good poet. I think he would have been an even better poet if he could have had the luxury of reading what he wrote, or always having somebody close at hand who could help him. But he had to wait. His wife did not speak Yiddish. He had to wait for people like Shane or another woman, Judith Maltz, the widow of a Yiddish writer, until they could come and write down. And I don't know if he made the poems on the spot or he made them. He geschaffen, he created them before. I'm not sure, and then just remembered them. It's kind of an amazing thing. And you may wonder why he didn't read his own poetry, and that's because he couldn't see it. So I read his poetry. Of course, it would have been great if he could have, but he couldn't.
Could we talk a little bit more about what his life was like in New York and the work that he did in the Yiddish community here?
I think you asked me in New York.
His life in New York and his work in the Yiddish community here, because we didn't hear very much about that in the film.
Sure. He edited the Zukunft journal for many years and was active with the Congress. He was apparently quite a vibrant speaker. I never really saw him on a public podium, just once or twice towards the end, but he could speak about Mendele or about whichever Yiddish writer you like, and he would cite passages verbatim. He didn't really work from notes, again, I guess because of problems with his vision. I don't know how active he was with the Bund here in New York. I'm not sure. I mean, our offices were all together in the Atranhuis, but like I say, I knew his work. And the Yiddish Pen Club, yeah. We were still getting mail for that, and I think Itzik Gottesman has that if it's still going. But I know just from the Congress what he did with Yiddish. The relationship to Yiddish was, I guess, a little problematic. I don't want to go into whatever, but he seemed really. You know, when he said he wanted his art to be seen by Mexicans, not just in the Jewish club there in Mexico City, he very much wanted his art to be recognized by the world. And he was very hungry for that. And he died very hungry for that, unfortunately.
Let me just add, I think that, at least according to my father, he was not, when he first came to New York, and I think for a long time, he was not that involved in Yiddish things. Maybe he was involved with the Vilna people, I'm not sure, all the time. But it's possible, I think he was trying to make a living. That was the first thing. And his wife was not Jewish, actually. So that might have kept him a little bit apart. He also had a son who was born with a disability, who had, I think, one arm, which for a painter is kind of a terrible tragedy, more than it even is. Although the son also painted with the arm that he had. So I think it really, maybe it wasn't almost till he retired from Hofstra, I'm not sure, that he sort of came out more into the Yiddish world and then became extremely active.
So while we're on that topic, Shane, do you want to talk about, or Sheva, what happened with his paintings and where they are now? We have these projections behind us and before the film.
Sure, I'll go into it. I'll try not to go there, but I'll go into it. He was very closely tied with Hofstra, and I guess he had made an arrangement that Hofstra would receive his Carroll Gardens brownstone, which became worth something over the course of his quite long life, as Melebt der Lebtman. And there was hope for a gallery at Hofstra under his name with a permanent exhibition of his paintings. I don't know if that's so. I know that there have been exhibitions of his work at Hofstra, but I don't know what exactly is. If someone from Hofstra is here, I'd be curious to hear. But I know that that house was full of paintings and, well, these are oils that you see projected here. But it also, there were maybe 1,000, I don't know how many, of these works that you projected, some of them in the film, the marker with pastel that he worked on even as his eyesight deteriorated, which were his eyewitness to history works. And Hofstra took a certain number of paintings, and beyond that, they didn't care to have more. So the executors, Adina Zimet and her husband, Mike Singer, wrote to various Yiddish organizations and got some of the paintings taken here and there around the world, and hopefully they're displayed. And the markers with pastels, no one seemed interested in. So I wound up with a heap of as many of them as we could transport at one time. And many others went to a New York City landfill, I guess, unless someone knows better. And that was the case with that. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Well, it was kind of a last-minute thing because there was a question: is Hofstra taking it? Are they not? Are they taking it? Are they not? And then there was a final date, and so a little bit went at a time. I have a flyer I'll happily pass along that just with some contact information. If someone knows how to share his work, we'd love to get it seen. Faggy has a couple there, but yeah, it's a very frustrating and sad story on some levels, especially given the brilliance that you all captured in the film, which anyone who knew him knew quite well. Yeah.
So maybe we could talk about his legacy a bit more, or Josh, did you have something you want to add? I'm also curious to hear a little bit more about his books, Sheva.
Books. Okay, so the first, as he was, it's funny, the questions you don't ask. When he was talking about Shanghai and how the critic Rappaport got the paper and my father said, I'll print it, as far as I know, no book ever came out in Shanghai. The first book came out in Mexico, and there are a lot of, if you're interested in the Shanghai period, there's quite a few poems about Shanghai in there, and they're certainly worth reading. And then he has another book called Good Guests, which came out maybe in the 60s, and this last book that I edited came out in 2008. And these are, I think, all poems that he wrote Linda Haidt, that were dictated. And you can, I would say that as a poet, it's often, he sometimes rhymes and sometimes very cleverly so. And sometimes he doesn't. And you're almost thinking, this is like prose, what's happening here? And then right at the end, there's some like really kind of brilliant little twist or insight that kind of just makes the whole poem. That's the best way to describe it. He has a book of prose called New Yorker Adressen, New York Addresses, that I think came out in Oxford. And I think the best story is one called The Hotel that we're studying now with my students in class. At least it's my favorite. And it's kind of Kafka-esque. And he has a number, it's interesting, he has one story called Vermeer. I don't remember what it was about, but I remember that I wanted him, Vermeer is a painter and one of his favorite painters, and I wanted to talk to him about it in the film. And I had all these questions, but I wanted him to talk about it as a story. And it was clear to me from watching the film and from when we edited it that painting was really, I think, his first love. And I kept kind of, because this is a film by the Yiddish Liga and it's all about words and Yiddish, and I kept trying to, get him back on track to talk about writing, and it was a lot harder. And so in this story about Vermeer, I wasn't interested in the painter. I was sort of interested in how he used that figure in the story, but he kind of took off and just talked about Vermeer and his painting, so we didn't put it in the film. But he does often write about painting, about sculpting. It's often a theme that recurs a lot. And sometimes he's kind of Kafkaesque in his stories. As he said, I mean, knowing him, I would find snippets of his life. There's one story about a father and a son, and the wife kind of chides the husband that he doesn't really pay enough attention to his son. And I think that this was probably a bone of contention. I think that his relationship with his son, although sometimes very close, was also, I think, quite pained, partly because of his disability, and then the son died young. So, yeah, snippets of his biography come in as well.
I remember in the editing that Sheva was trying always to guide me away from using portions of the interview that were about art. Let's try to steer it towards literature. But I found one of the interesting things I found in editing the film was the way that his telling of the stories, the episodes of his own life, was quite literary. And it really I was thinking at one point, gee, it's a shame we don't have more of his literature in the film. And I realized, actually we do, because, and it's interesting to hear you talk about his method of writing without being able to revise and work over a manuscript as many writers are able to do. One can almost see him composing the episode as he sits there and tells the story about getting out of Russia or whatever the story is. So I think in some ways the film, we were lucky to capture in a way the literary process at work, because he was still in full command of his faculties as he was telling the story of his life.
He was a great raconteur. I mean, just you'd come to visit and he would just tell you stories.
On the same topic, or the topic of what's literature and what's painting, he said at one point also that when he didn't have words for something, then he painted it, and when he couldn't paint it, then he would describe it with words. So they were like hand in hand for him, and he made his own illustrations for New Yorker Adressen as well. I have some of those drawings. He also illustrated Sutzkever's books, a book called Dorten wo es nächtigt in die Sternen, and I hope that the YIVO received the copper engraving plates from that, because who knows what happened with these things, but those were still in the house. That'd make a nice display, those with the actual prints from the book. And his ability to revise his life. I heard the Diego Rivera story from him that, okay, he told the Lyudmila portion that she told him that he had to get out, but he had already decided that he was going to leave Russia or Soviet Russia because he didn't like Soviet realism, which was then in style, and this would not fit him. So he already had to get out, and that when he came to Mexico and Diego Rivera asked him, "Why did you leave Russia?" that he answered, "Because I wanted to study with you," which he felt would so maybe he revised that, or maybe he gave both answers, but yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. I think it's time for us to continue this conversation in the hall. Just a quick reminder that films are on sale. If you'd like to purchase a copy, you can talk to Shane or get information about some of Yoni's art. And we have a little nosh for you, so we'll see you out there.